After decades stored away, this photograph revealed a detail that changes how we understand slavery. Dr. Lisa Morrison had spent 3 weeks in the basement archives of the Charleston Heritage Museum, cataloging photographs that hadn't been properly examined in over 40 years. The museum was preparing a comprehensive digital database, and Lisa, a specialist in 19th century American photography and slavery history, had been hired to assess and document their collection of pre-Civil War images. Most of what she found was predictable: formal portraits of wealthy families, landscape photographs of plantations, architectural documentation of historic buildings. The images were valuable for research, but rarely surprising. She had developed a rhythm: photograph the item, record its dimensions and condition, note any identifying marks or inscriptions, move to the next box. Then she opened an unmarked cardboard container tucked behind several larger boxes in the far corner of the storage room. Inside, wrapped in a deteriorating tissue paper, was a daguerreotype that immediately caught her attention. The image showed a well-dressed man standing near a seated woman who was clearly enslaved based on her simple clothing and the context of the era. But something about the photograph felt different from the typical servant portraits or propaganda images that plantation owners commissioned. The woman's expression, captured in the remarkable detail that daguerreotypes could achieve, showed something Lisa had rarely seen in photographs from this era: a direct, unflinching gaze at the camera. Her eyes held a quality that seemed to transcend her circumstances, a quiet defiance that contradicted everything the photograph's composition was meant to convey. Lisa's hands trembled slightly as she held the metal plate up to the archival light. On the back, written in faded ink, were just 3 words and a year: Charleston, South Carolina, 1857. No names, no context. Just this powerful image that had been hidden away for decades, perhaps deliberately forgotten. She photographed it with her digital camera, her mind already racing with questions. Who was this woman? What was her story? And most importantly, why had this photograph been stored away, unmarked and uncatalogued, as if someone wanted it to disappear from history? Lisa knew that behind every such photograph was a human story waiting to be recovered. Lisa spent the next morning researching Charleston daguerreotypists who were active in 1857. The photographic studios of that era kept detailed business records, and many had survived in various archives. She needed to find out who had taken this photograph, and, if possible, who had commissioned it. Her breakthrough came from the Charleston Historical Society's digital archive, a business ledger from the studio of William Thompson, one of the city's most prominent photographers, listed appointments and clients. The entry for March 1857 included a notation: portrait commission, private residence, payment received in full. The client's name was listed as Richard Ashford, a wealthy cotton merchant who owned a townhouse in Charleston's most exclusive district. Lisa's pulse quickened. Now she had a name, a location, and a starting point for deeper research. She pulled every record she could find related to Richard Ashford. Property deeds showed he owned not just the Charleston townhouse, but also a plantation 40 miles inland. Tax records from 1857 listed his assets, including, as was standard for the time, enslaved people. The documentation was clinical and dehumanizing: ages, gender, assigned work, but no names. That evening, Lisa visited the South Carolina Historical Society's library, where she knew they maintained collections of personal papers from prominent Charleston families. The Ashford family papers had been donated in 1923, following the death of Richard Ashford's last direct descendant. Among the letters and business correspondence, Lisa found something remarkable: a small leather journal that had belonged to Richard Ashford's sister, Eleanor. The journal covered the years 1855 to 1860, and Eleanor had been a frequent visitor to her brother's household. In an entry dated March 1857, the same month as the daguerreotype, Eleanor wrote about visiting her brother's home and mentioned something that made Lisa sit up straighter. "I met the woman who manages Richard's household with such capability. Her name is Hannah. She carries herself with remarkable dignity despite her circumstances. Richard insists on having her portrait made, though I cannot fathom his reasoning." Hannah, the woman in the photograph, finally had a name. Having a name changed everything. Lisa began searching through every available source for mentions of Hannah in connection with the Ashford household: plantation records, city directories, church registries, anywhere that might contain information about enslaved people in Charleston during the 1850s. The search was frustrating. As was typical of the era, enslaved people rarely appeared in official documents except as property listings. Their stories, their voices, their experiences were systematically excluded from the historical record that white society carefully preserved. But Lisa knew that absence from official records didn't mean absence of story. Enslaved people had found ways to preserve their histories, their identities, and their resistance through oral traditions, through testimonies recorded after emancipation, through the careful preservation of family knowledge passed down through generations. She reached out to Dr. James Carter, a colleague at Howard University who specialized in slave narratives and post-emancipation testimonies. James had spent decades building a database of interviews conducted with formerly enslaved people and their descendants, cross-referencing names, locations, and plantations to create a comprehensive picture of enslaved communities. "Send me everything you have," James told her over the phone. Name, location, approximate age, any details from the photograph. If Hannah survived to emancipation, and if anyone recorded her testimony, I'll find it. 3 days later, James called back. His voice carried excitement. Lisa, I found her. Or rather, I found someone who might be her. The Federal Writers Project interviewed a woman named Sarah in 1936. She was 93 years old, living in Charleston. In her testimony, she talked about her grandmother, Hannah, who had been enslaved in Charleston before the war. Sarah said her grandmother used to tell stories about her life in the city, about working in a wealthy merchant's household. Lisa's heart raced. Do you have the full interview? I'm sending it now. But Lisa, there's something else. Sarah mentions that her grandmother, Hannah, kept something hidden her entire life. A photograph. She said Hannah called it her proof of who she was. Oh, what? Sarah inherited it when Hannah died in 1891, but it was lost sometime in the early 1900s during a house fire. The photograph. It had to be the same one Lisa had found in the museum archives. The interview with Sarah, conducted in 1936 by a Federal Writers Project interviewer, was 18 pages long. Lisa read it 3 times, absorbing every detail, hearing Hannah's story filtered through her granddaughter's memory, but no less powerful for the distance. Sarah described her grandmother as a woman of quiet strength and fierce intelligence. Grandma Hannah never talked much about slavery times, Sarah had told the interviewer. It pained her, but sometimes, late at night when it was just us, women sitting together, she would tell us things. She wanted us to know we came from people who survived, who kept their dignity even when everything was taken from them. Hannah had been born around 1835, Sarah believed, though exact birth records for enslaved people were rare. She had grown up on a plantation, but was brought to Charleston as a teenager to work in Richard Ashford's household. The work was demanding, managing the entire domestic operation of a wealthy merchant's townhouse, but Hannah had proven herself extraordinarily capable. Grandma said she learned to read and write in secret. Sarah's testimony continued. There was a woman in the neighborhood, a free black woman who ran a secret school. Grandma would sneak out on Sunday afternoons, said she was going to church, but really she was learning her letters. She said education was the one thing nobody could take from her, the one thing she could keep in her head where no master could reach it. This revelation struck Lisa deeply. Literacy among enslaved people was not only discouraged, but often explicitly illegal in southern states. The risk Hannah had taken to educate herself spoke to her courage and her determination to maintain control over her own mind and identity. The testimony continued with Hannah's description of life in the Ashford household, the careful navigation of power dynamics, the constant vigilance required to protect herself and maintain her sense of self. And then Sarah mentioned the photograph again. Grandma kept that picture hidden in a Bible for years. She said it was important because it showed the truth, not the lies white folks told about slavery being kind or enslaved people being content. She said, when you looked at her eyes in that picture, you could see who she really was, not who they tried to make her be. Lisa understood now. The photograph wasn't just documentation of slavery. It was Hannah's silent testimony, her refusal to play the role expected of her. As Lisa dug deeper into Hannah's story, she discovered something that historians had long suspected but rarely found concrete evidence for, an extensive network of communication and mutual support among enslaved women in Charleston. Hannah hadn't survived alone. She had been part of a community that shared information, resources, and strategies for survival. Eleanor Ashford's journal provided unexpected insights into this network. Though Eleanor wrote from the perspective of a white woman who accepted slavery as natural, her observations revealed details she didn't fully understand. An entry from June 1857 noted, "The enslaved women in this neighborhood seem to have formed their own peculiar society. They gather on Sunday afternoons, ostensibly for church and prayer, but I suspect they discuss matters beyond spiritual concerns. Hannah attends these gatherings regularly." Lisa smiled at Eleanor's unwitting documentation of resistance. Those Sunday gatherings were likely how Hannah attended the secret school, how information about escape routes spread, how women supported each other through the daily trauma of their circumstances. Further research uncovered records from the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy of 1822, 35 years before the photograph was taken. Though the planned rebellion had been betrayed and crushed, the network of communication it had relied upon, particularly among Charleston's enslaved and free black communities, had never been fully dismantled. It had simply become more careful, more hidden. Lisa found references in court records, in newspaper articles about suspicious gatherings, in the anxious letters of white Charleston residents who sensed something beneath the surface but couldn't quite identify it. The network was there, invisible to official history but undeniably present. She reached out to local historians and genealogists in Charleston's black community, many of whom had spent years researching their family histories and preserving oral traditions. They confirmed what Lisa was discovering. The stories of Hannah and women like her had been passed down through generations, kept alive even when official history tried to erase them. One historian, a woman named Dorothy, shared her great-great-grandmother's diary written in the 1880s. It mentioned Hannah by name, describing her as a woman of remarkable character who had endured much but never lost herself. The diary included a detail that made Lisa's research suddenly personal. Hannah had helped other enslaved women learn to read. continuing the secret education she had received. The question that haunted Lisa was why the photograph had been taken at all. Daguerreotypes were expensive, commissioned for specific purposes. Richard Ashford had paid for this image, but why? And how had Hannah felt about being photographed? The answer came from an unexpected source. While researching Richard Ashford's business correspondence, Lisa found letters he had exchanged with his cousin in Boston. The cousin, a textile manufacturer, had written to Richard in early 1857 expressing skepticism about slavery, influenced by the growing abolitionist movement in the North. Richard's response, written in February 1857, was defensive and revealing. You claim that slavery degrades both enslaved and enslaver, that it destroys the humanity of those held in bondage. I shall prove otherwise. I am having a portrait made of the woman who manages my household. When you see her dignity, her capable bearing, you will understand that slavery here in Charleston is nothing like the horror stories your abolitionist friends tell. Lisa sat back, understanding flooding through her. Richard Ashford had commissioned the photograph as propaganda, as proof that slavery could be benign. He had wanted to show Hannah as evidence that enslaved people could maintain dignity under slavery, not understanding, or not caring, that what he was actually documenting was Hannah's resistance to having her humanity crushed. But Hannah had turned his intention on its head. Instead of showing contentment or acceptance, her expression in the photograph radiated something else entirely. She had looked directly at the camera with eyes that refused to perform the role expected of her. She had made sure the photograph captured her truth, not his narrative. Lisa found more evidence in Eleanor's journal. An entry from the day after the photograph was taken read, Richard is quite pleased with the portrait made yesterday. He believes it will serve his purpose in his debate with Cousin William. But I confess, when I look at the woman's face in that image, I see something that unsettles me. There is a defiance there, subtle but unmistakable. I wonder if Richard notices it, or if he sees only what he wishes to see. Eleanor had noticed what her brother had missed. And now, over a century and a half later, Lisa was documenting it for history. Through Sarah's testimony and additional research, Lisa began to piece together what happened to Hannah after the photograph was taken. The Civil War came to Charleston in 1861, 4 years after the daguerreotype was made. Richard Ashford, like many wealthy Charleston merchants, lost much of his fortune as the Confederacy collapsed and the cotton trade was destroyed. When Union forces occupied Charleston in February 1865, Hannah was 30 years old. According to Sarah's testimony, Hannah was among the first to leave the Ashford household when freedom came. Grandma said she walked out that door and never looked back. She said she'd dreamed of that moment every single day for 30 years. But freedom brought new challenges. Hannah had no formal education that white society would recognize, no property, no resources, except her intelligence and determination. Like thousands of other newly freed people, she had to build a life from nothing in a society that remained hostile to black independence. Hannah found work as a seamstress, using skills she had developed while enslaved. She rented a small room in a boarding house run by a community of formerly enslaved women who supported each other through the difficult years of Reconstruction. And according to family oral history, she continued teaching literacy classes, now openly rather than in secret. Lisa found Hannah's name in Freedmen's Bureau records from 1866. She had registered to vote, one of the first black women in Charleston to do so during the brief period when Reconstruction made such things possible. She had also testified in a bureau hearing about labor conditions, advocating for fair wages for domestic workers. My grandmother never stopped fighting, Sarah had told her interviewer in 1936. Even when things got bad after Reconstruction ended, even when Jim Crow came and took away so many of the freedoms we'd won, Grandma kept teaching people to read. She said education was power, and nobody could take that away if you held it in your mind and heart. Hannah married in 1867 to a man named Joseph, who had also been enslaved in Charleston. They had 3 children, though only one, Sarah's mother Clara, survived to adulthood. Hannah lived until 1891, dying at approximately 56 years old, which was a long life for someone who had endured the physical hardships of slavery and the poverty of the post-war years. Lisa became obsessed with tracing how the daguerreotype had traveled from Hannah's possession to the museum's forgotten archive. The story of the photograph's journey turned out to be almost as revealing as the image itself. According to Sarah's testimony, Hannah had kept the photograph hidden throughout her life, wrapped in cloth inside her Bible. She said it was proof, Sarah had explained to her interviewer, proof that she had lived, proof of what she'd endured, proof that she'd kept her soul intact when they tried to break her. Onders, Hannah had given the photograph to her daughter Clara sometime in the 1880s, with instructions to preserve it for future generations. Tell them, Hannah had said, tell them we were human beings, not property. Tell them we resisted, we survived, we kept our dignity. That picture shows the truth, even though the man who paid for it couldn't see it. But the photograph was lost, or so the family believed in 1903 when Clara's house burned down. Sarah had mourned its loss, telling the interviewer that it felt like losing a piece of her grandmother all over again. Yet somehow the daguerreotype had survived. Lisa traced it through property records and museum acquisition logs. The house fire had indeed occurred, but apparently someone had salvaged items from the wreckage. Those items, including a damaged Bible and several photographs, had been sold to a curiosity dealer who specialized in historical artifacts. From there, the trail went cold for several decades. The photograph changed hands multiple times, eventually ending up in the collection of a Charleston antiquarian who died in 1941. His entire collection was donated to the Charleston Heritage Museum, where it had been catalogued, or rather miscatalogued, as unidentified daguerreotype, circa 1850s, and stored in the basement archives where Lisa had found it. The photograph had survived fire, neglect, and the erasure of memory. It had waited 75 years to be properly identified and understood. Hannah's testimony, preserved in silver and glass, had endured. Lisa prepared a comprehensive report on her findings, documenting Hannah's life, the photograph's history, and its significance for understanding enslaved women's experiences and resistance. The Charleston Heritage Museum agreed to feature the daguerreotype in a new permanent exhibition on slavery and freedom in Charleston. But Lisa wanted Hannah's descendants involved. She worked with genealogists to trace Sarah's family line forward from 1936. It took weeks of research, following paper trails through marriages, migrations, and name changes, but eventually they found them. Marcus Johnson, Hannah's great-great-great-grandson, lived in Atlanta. He was a high school history teacher, 62 years old, and he had grown up hearing fragments of family stories about an ancestor named Hannah who had been enslaved in Charleston. But the details had been lost over generations. The specifics faded. When Lisa called him and explained what she had discovered, Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then his voice cracked with emotion. "You found her. You found Hannah." Marcus traveled to Charleston with his family for the exhibition opening. Lisa met them at the museum on a quiet morning before the public event, giving them time alone with the photograph. Marcus stood before the daguerreotype for several minutes without speaking, tears running down his face. His daughter, a college student named Maya, leaned close to the image, studying Hannah's expression. "Look at her eyes," Maya said softly. "She's looking right at us, right through time, like she knew we'd see this someday." "She did know," Marcus replied. "And that's why she kept it. That's why she told my great-great-grandmother Sarah to remember. She wanted us to know who she was, to know that she survived with her dignity intact." The museum director, who had been standing respectfully in the background, approached. "Mr. Johnson, we'd be honored if you would speak at tonight's opening, if you'd share Hannah's story with the community." Marcus nodded. Hannah made sure her voice survived. "The least I can do is help it be heard." That evening, over 200 people gathered for the exhibition opening. The photograph was displayed prominently, surrounded by the context Lisa had researched, excerpts from Eleanor's journal, pages from Sarah's testimony, documents about the secret school and the network of resistance that Hannah had been part of. The exhibition, titled Hannah's Testament, One Woman's Silent Resistance, ran for 6 months at the Charleston Heritage Museum and drew visitors from across the country. But its impact extended far beyond the museum walls. The story of Hannah and the photograph sparked conversations about how slavery is remembered, about whose voices are preserved in historical records, and about the importance of looking deeper at images that have been overlooked or misunderstood. Other museums began re-examining their collections, searching for similar photographs that might contain hidden stories. Historians started paying closer attention to the expressions and body language of enslaved people in historical images, recognizing that these details could reveal resistance and humanity that the photograph's original purposes had tried to obscure. Marcus Johnson became an advocate for preserving black family histories and oral traditions. He worked with genealogists and historians to help other families trace their roots and recover stories that official records had erased. "Hannah taught me something," he told a journalist who interviewed him for a national magazine. "She taught me that survival itself is resistance, that maintaining your humanity in the face of dehumanization is an act of courage, and that bearing witness, even silently, matters." Lisa's research was published in several academic journals, and it eventually expanded into a book, Beyond the Frame: Recovering the Lives and Resistance of Enslaved Women Through Photography. The book used Hannah's story as a starting point to examine dozens of other photographs, revealing patterns of subtle resistance and self-assertion that changed how historians understood enslaved people's agency. The photograph itself became an iconic image in discussions of American slavery, reproduced in textbooks and documentaries, but always with Hannah's full story attached, not just as a nameless victim, but as a woman with an identity, a history, a community, and descendants who carried her legacy forward. Maya Johnson, Marcus's daughter, wrote her senior thesis on Hannah's secret school and the network of literacy education among enslaved women in Charleston. She continued to graduate school, pursuing a PhD in African American history, inspired by her ancestors' commitment to education and self-determination. On the anniversary of the exhibition's opening, the museum held a special event where descendants of other enslaved people in Charleston came forward with their family stories, many prompted by Hannah's example. The museum began a new initiative to document these oral histories, ensuring they would be preserved alongside the official records that had long excluded them. Lisa stood in the gallery that evening, watching families gather around photographs and documents, sharing stories and making connections. She thought about Hannah, about how a single daguerreotype, nearly lost to history, had become a catalyst for remembering and honoring thousands of other lives. The photograph showed Hannah as she was in 1857, a woman in bondage but unbroken, looking directly into the camera with eyes that refused to accept the role slavery tried to force upon her. That gaze, preserved across a century and a half, had finally found the audience Hannah had hoped for, people who would see her truth, honor her resistance, and ensure that her story, and stories like hers, would never be forgotten again. In a quiet moment, Marcus approached Lisa. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for seeing her, for seeing past what everyone else overlooked for so long." Lisa shook her head. "I only uncovered what Hannah made sure would survive. She's the one who testified. She's the one who refused to let them erase her. I just helped people finally hear what she'd been saying all along." Together, they looked at the photograph one more time. Hannah's face, her unforgettable eyes, her silent but powerful testament to survival, resistance, and the unbreakable human spirit. The image that had been hidden for decades had finally revealed not just one woman's story, but a truth that changed how we understand slavery. That even in the darkest circumstances, people found ways to preserve their humanity, resist dehumanization, and ensure that their voices would eventually be heard. Hannah had won. Her testimony survived. And now finally the world was listening.